Welcome to a preview of the Local News Matters podcast. My name is Tim Regan-Porter, and I'm the CEO of the Colorado Press Association, the trade group for print and online news media in Colorado, and of the Colorado Press Network, our ad placement agency. In Local News Matters, I sit down with guests from newsrooms and support organizations across the U.S. to highlight the interesting and innovative work of local newsrooms, as well as the crucial questions they face as they endeavor to evolve their organizations to produce more meaningful journalism, to better serve their communities, and to enhance their organization's financial sustainability for long-term results. We'll delve into a wide range of topics in extended conversations, provide key takeaways for the TLDR set, and even summarize recent industry news. Anyone doing new or exemplary work or proffering thought-provoking insights is fair game. Whether you're a newsroom leader, a sales executive, or just a citizen who cares deeply about informed communities, I hope you'll find something here worth your time. In this preview, you can hear excerpts from guest interviews in the first 4 podcasts. In the first episode, I sit down with Todd Chamberlin and Raleigh Burleigh of the Sopris Sun, a weekly nonprofit newsroom in Brandel, Colorado. I wanted to talk with them first because weekly newspapers throughout the country have proven surprisingly resilient, and Raleigh recently received the Innovation Award from CPA. Together we explored the work they're doing there, including what it takes to innovate. Here's Todd, then Raleigh.
To be an innovator, not only do you have to have a great idea, but you have to have the fortitude to make that happen.
It's one thing to be innovative and come up with ideas. It's another to make that financially viable.
The results they've seen since forming in response to the closure of a previous paper.
And so I think what's really miraculous about our story, and it says a lot about the town that we live in and serve, it really only took 6 weeks for some Carbondale locals to put together an alternative, which is the Sopris Sun. And it was covered by a big LA newspaper. Just this notion that a nonprofit newsroom could be successful back then, 2009, in the recession, people had their doubts. So we're coming up on 14 years. And in the past 2 in particular, we've really expanded our reach and our coverage, as well as our budget.
So overall, in the last 2 years, our budget has actually doubled. And the size of our paper has also increased.
And the advantages of being a weekly nonprofit.
We live in an age where we're so inundated with information all the time, especially from our phones. And there's something special to a weekly product where we really take our time and we get to sleep on questions.
Instead of hard sales, I went out to the community and said, hey, we're a nonprofit. If you support us, you're supporting the community.
And I think being a nonprofit, it's in our DNA that, this belongs to our community more than it does to anyone on staff or even our board of directors.
Next, I explored journalism, entrepreneurship, and community listening with Jennifer Brandel, an award-winning journalist and co-founder of Hearken, as well as Zebras Unite and Democracy SOS. We discuss Jen's circuitous route to journalism.
I kind of spent a lot of my 20s just kind of, experimenting with a lot of different jobs, trying to understand what I wanted to do, almost by virtue of what I don't like to do. So, just trying on a lot of different hats. I was a ghostwriter for an exotic dancer and for John Hughes, the late, movie director who made Pretty in Pink and 16 Candles and all that stuff. I worked in Tasmania picking grapes. I was a psychometric test developer in Montreal. And each of these experiences gave me an understanding of what I really enjoyed and what I didn't. So it was almost by process of elimination that I found myself back in journalism about 5 or so years after I initially was interning at NPR and realizing that, journalism was this job where you could get paid to learn, to be in spaces you otherwise would have no other business being in, to have people listen to you, and to be able to ask questions of folks, again, you never would have come across otherwise, and to be creative and trying to be of service of your community.
I'm still kicking myself for not following up on ghostwriting for John Hughes and an exotic dancer. Anyway, it didn't take long for Jen to realize that the field needed to flip the script to find a new way of relating to the community and making them part of the process.
And I just kept thinking about how the process of journalism would change if we started off not assuming we knew what others needed to know, but assuming that they were smart enough to have their own needs, and they might need help finding information that journalists are uniquely positioned to do. And so that was the start of Curious City, really based on this principle of start by listening, start by, trying to understand the questions people have and really accompanying them on finding those answers, and not just telling them the answer, but really showing them how you found it and trying to leave people better off. It's essentially the same process of, kind of like design thinking, has these steps. Ours is similar to design thinking, but it's about listening all the time rather than just as one step, and having empathy all the time rather than just one step.
Among the many topics we discuss, Jen offers lessons she's learned in working with scores of newsrooms across the country and the world, and what it takes for institutions to innovate.
It really is about making sure you have buy-in from the right people and for the right amount of time to give something a go. And that you do set some sort of benchmarks as to what you expect and check in over time to make sure it's going in that direction. And the ability to kind of like call an audible here and there and say, hey, it's not working how we thought. Do we still think it should continue, or should we massively rewrite our hypothesis?
Innovating with limited time and money.
I also think just starting small, and if you're not in a position like most newsrooms are not, in which there's, free floating dollars to try new things and throw spaghetti at the wall, it's about trying to figure out who in your newsroom already has like a sparkle in their eye to try something new, and not trying to force someone, into doing something top down that they wouldn't otherwise be interested in doing.
Her reaction to a common saying in journalism:
I always hate it when people say give voice to the voiceless, because it's like, people have always had a voice. It's just you're not listening. So I feel like I hear that over and over again of like, our job is to give voice to the voiceless. Like, no, your job is to actually shut the hell up and listen and let those people tell their own stories. Those people as in everyone else outside of, your news org that you feel like you're being a savior to.
Alternative motivations and approaches to diversity.
I think there's probably a lot of people who understand just on a very basic level that diversity is good, because not having it is unjust. But I would challenge people to think more about the problems that are there to be solved, that can be solved by people who have lived experience and who have a point of view that they're bringing, and who have talent and genius that have yet to be recognized or given an opportunity, what that world could look like when everyone's able to contribute to the best of their ability. Engagement is one intermediate step, in that if you don't have a newsroom that adequately reflects the demographics of who you're trying to serve, you can still involve them in the story making process, even if they're not on staff, by inviting them into the process of creating your journalism.
An alternative way to view the job of journalism.
How could they think of themselves more as a node in a network for mutual aid, whether that aid was around information or otherwise? And as the pandemic hit and other, crises, climate crises have hit, I see more and more the need for like newsrooms to be in the mutual aid business.
And her reflection on the pace of change in journalism and society.
I was staying at an Airbnb this weekend for a friend's baby shower. And on the bedroom of the room I was staying in was a timeline of the history of the world. And it had like, all the eras back to like the Big Bang and, dinosaurs and different empires and whatnot. And it really is remarkable. When I think to myself, God, the news industry is not changing fast enough. Like, all these sorts of things that I get really impatient about is like, it is, a lot has changed in the last few years. Do I wish it were faster? Do I think it could be faster? Absolutely. But like, what do I expect? Human beings have only been around for a hot minute, in the grand scheme of things. And, we have a lot of pressures on our lives besides trying to figure out new ways to do our work, among the other demands. So I think that there's reason to hope, but there's also a lot of threat in the next few years, specifically into losing, the start of this experiment, losing a lot of ground on the start of this experiment we call American democracy.
Then we delve deeper into listening with Eve Pearlman and Erica Anderson of Spaceship Media. Spaceship Media specializes in dialogue journalism to bridge divides, and they recently produced The Wedge, a 6-part podcast distributed by Colorado Public Radio, where Erica and her mom record some fraught conversations over the course of a year around COVID vaccines. As Erica explains,
one of the tenets of Spaceship's work is to start by listening. And I realized that my mom and I had been doing a lot of talking at one another and exchanging facts and arguing and hanging up on one another and, and not, so really just continuing to try to do the same thing and hope for different results. And so the very first part of this project was me taking a step back and saying, okay, well, if I'm a journalist, what do journalists do? They ask questions and they listen at the beginning. And I realized there was a lot of things I didn't know about my mom, just in who she is in the world, but also kind of what drives her. And she's had quite a life.
Over the course of the conversations, we hear Erica in dialogue with her mom, Eve, her therapist, yes, we're invited onto the proverbial couch, and others as she struggles with her goals and her instinct to intellectualize things.
Yeah, I think that was a big realization. And I think it's something that we do as journalists, sort of this idea of, objectivity, that somehow you could stop being a human to report on something and that would in any way serve you. And obviously, that's tricky, talking about bias and things like that. But I think we also do this a lot to just make it through the world, to make it through our day. You have to, intellectualize things a little bit to separate it from you. But in this case, that wasn't serving my life. And it also wasn't honest because, what was driving me was absolute terror. And I wasn't acknowledging that. I was making it about my mom being wrong.
What started out as an illustration of dialogue journalism turned into something much more personal, centered around individuals and relationships.
It was like there were two goals. I wanted to maintain a relationship with my mother and have it be, an honest and open and loving relationship. And I wanted my mom to change her mind about her views. And those two things I hoped could coexist. But it made it incredibly frustrating because as a journalist, I have access to, I have an experience of how to research and how to find experts and how to talk to them. And so I had hoped, I'll bring my mother into my world and she will see the light, of the truth of what this is. And it didn't work. That's not, that's not how the world works. And there are so many conversations where I would come to Eve and I would say, it's not working. And she goes, that's not the point. The point is maintaining the connection. And then we see what happens because you can't get anywhere with anyone if you're not in connection. And I was like, yeah, totally. But I'm still going to change your mind. That was just this constant piece. And I often feel, so we have these big conversations and people are in a room or online and they're, finding common ground. These people who, voted for Trump and voted for Hillary and they're not feeling animosity towards each other. And then my question always is, okay, so now what? How do we change the people's minds who are wrong? And then it's like this. So I'm constantly having to reset of just, that isn't the point. Even is as frustrating as that is, for journalists who want to talk about, big T truth, we set out to make a piece that I thought was going to be a lot more about facts and changing minds and showing the journalistic process to someone who was not a journalist. And that's not ultimately what that brought any sort of conclusion to this or any kind of payoff. But to me, this does feel like a piece of service. I'm just like, you too can do this. But don't do it without help and support.
And we do explore tips for journalists or anyone wanting to have productive, meaningful, and informed conversations across differences. Eve and Erica also discuss engagement journalism's role in the news ecosystem and its focus on service.
I always think that there's just lots and lots of ways to do journalism. To be a journalist, there's, great value in the piece that takes 3 years. There's great value in the piece that lets you know why the street is closed down there. It's different, but we need that. There is a movement, you alluded to it, engagement journalism, participatory journalism, constructive journalism. There's a lot of people who are working on the same sorts of challenges to the kind of journalistic positioning that doesn't invite consideration and empathy and expansiveness and humility. And so I think we're seeing all kinds of efforts to do it differently. I mean, I think I often sit on the point of we don't have a shortage of information, right? There's plenty of good reporting that exists, but we do have a shortage of people being able to hear it. And that's why, Spaceship sits where Spaceship sits. It's how can we make it so the facts that I bear are hearable and consumable or digestible.
I feel really privileged for the fact that my lens into journalism was through this engagement style of journalism, and seeing first and foremost, is this thing that you are making going to serve someone or a population or a community of people? Is this giving them information that they need? Is this somehow making their life better? Is it giving them a blueprint? Is it giving them a tool?
I want to flag that as a really important thing as I think about Spaceship's work and many other journalistic innovator works as centering community, not the reporter. So not my byline, my story, my brand, but what am I doing to be in service to, in our case, divided communities who aren't hearing each other, but across the board. And I think when you show up in service, people know that and hear that. And that's very different than showing up extractively, right? Here, give me the quote that fits my story. Give me a soundbite that says what I have in mind you should say so that it flows in my piece. It's just a very different orientation. And I sort of believe that, as the news and information space has gotten fragmented and cacophonous, it becomes even more vital to sit in that space of humility with empathy and service, because people feel that. And that's what you have going for you that trumps everything else, because people respond to real connection.
In the fourth episode, Michael Bolden, Executive Director and CEO of the American Press Institute, expounds on local news and democracy.
There is a huge question about local news and maintaining its place as an enabler of our democratic society and institutions. It is no accident that freedom of the press is enshrined in the First Amendment. The founding fathers clearly knew, first of all, that American democracy is an experiment. George Washington spoke of it as the last great experiment in civic happiness. And, we think about the pursuit of happiness. When we hear that, we often think it's about individual happiness, but it's not. It's about how we exist and coexist together, and the ability to make decisions together that affects how we live and how our society functions, and ensuring that people have the information they need is a vital part of what the free press does. And so at the local level, we have to have a robust, thriving free press providing people with the information they need, whether it's in Denver or Arlington or Burlington, Vermont. It's absolutely critical. Otherwise, we're going to see more of our democratic freedoms slip away because people won't have the information they need to coexist in our communities. So I think that is one of the first things that we need to hold up as important. And remember that context when we're dealing with everything else that comes our way, that freedom of the press is an enabler of what is a great democratic experiment. And when it suffers, our democracy will suffer.
The crucial role of listening in local news.
How connected are you to the people who are in your backyard, and how involved are they in helping to set your coverage priorities and your relationships? One of the things that I fundamentally believe has to be a part of any local news operation is, what does your community listening look like? How are you actually connecting with people and hearing them as opposed to imposing your will on them?
The mindset that listening requires.
Well, it does take a different mindset. And I mean, I think it takes a huge amount of humility because your assumptions are going to be challenged. You're probably going to be told that you're wrong about something. And none of us wants to be wrong about anything, right? And that can be one of the reasons why it's so difficult for people to sort of acknowledge what's going astray.
The problem of defining journalism and the roles of legacy media and startups.
But it will never be one thing or the other. It will be all of these things. It will be some legacy broadcasters and publishers and whomever who have figured out how to better serve audiences and who have created pathways to sustainability. It will be some digital native organizations. It will be nonprofit legacy media like NPR. It will be bloggers and the guy who's on Twitter or Mastodon or whatever tweeting the scanner news. It will be all of these things. And so I think when we talk about where do we put the investment, it isn't about making a bet on one or the other. It's about making strategic bets in areas throughout the ecosystem. I was recently in Denver for the convening of the major market public media television stations, included Rocky Mountain PBS, and the chief content officer there. She spoke about this very problem in Colorado, where you go out to some communities and the best known person who has the most ability to reach people is someone who has no professional journalism training whatsoever. She was actually speaking about a specific person in the example that she gave. And it was like, do we not bring that person inside our tent, to help in our conversations? Do we just write them off because they're not a journalist? And I think that anybody who's very aware of what's happening in the marketplace now, you say, of course not. Of course we want that person to be part of our efforts, right? It's the same point I was making about Larry Calhoun, the guy who runs DC Real-Time News and who's tweeting the scanner stuff. It's like, okay, we can say, well, he has no journalism training. He's not a professional journalist. But that does not diminish the role that he has in the news and information ecosystem. So how do we all learn to coexist, and how do we all learn from one another? I think that that's the important question that we have to keep at the forefront, because otherwise we're not serving the members of the community well at all, because they're not going to write people off, especially now when people are getting information from so many diffuse sources.
The interplay between good journalism, cultural relevancy, healthy newsroom environments, and financial health.
We want to make sure that we are supporting news organizations on the path to being culturally and financially healthy. Those two things do not exist independently. So when you talk about things like diversity and inclusion and making sure that you have online harassment support and trauma training for your journalists, that is absolutely as important as understanding your community and having revenue models that make sense. Those things do not exist in a vacuum. So what we're going to be talking about a lot in the new year is what is a holistic news organization and redefining success. Because success will not just be being fiscally viable, because eventually that will fall short if you're ignoring your community, or if you can't get journalists in the door because they're, the people who come into your shop are too burned out. It's really about marrying those things together And frankly, I don't think anybody in the industry has been talking about those things being so intertwined.
Episodes will start dropping weekly at the end of January. Subscribe in your favorite podcast app and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. I look forward to continuing the conversation and hope you'll join us.